Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the UVA Institute of Democracy Daily Aftermath webinar. We have been doing these after the election programming. Today is the day after the day after. And we'll do this tomorrow again at this time and also again on Monday. And Monday we'll be featuring our friends and partners at the Karsh Center on Law at Democracy at the law school. And they'll be looking into litigation. So please hold that on your calendar because that's an emerging issue in this election and post-election period. We're really delighted to be back with you, and we really want to thank the George and Judy Marcus Family Foundation and their Democracy Praxis Fund, which has allowed us to do these programmings. I'm going to introduce our three panelists today, and then my co-host and the leader of this whole aftermath effort, Melody Barnes. But I'll start with our panelists. First, we have, in alphabetical order, we have Paul Friedman, who's an associate professor in the Department of Politics here at the University of Virginia. Paul teaches courses in media, campaigns and elections, research methods, and the politics of food. He's a founding member of the UVA Food Collaborative, and he's also the academic director of the Morvan Summer Institute. Paul won the University of Virginia Alumni Board's Trustees Teaching Award, and he has also served as the first Edward Ayers Advising Fellow in the College of Arts and Sciences. Ed Ayers, a friend of many of us here. Paul is the co-author of Campaign Advertising in American Democracy, and since 2000, he's been an election analyst for ABC News in New York, including helping make the call on one state or another. Kevin Gaines is the Julian Bond Professor of Civil Rights and Social Justice at the University of Virginia and a Miller Center Senior Fellow. He's also a Senior Fellow at the Carter Woodson Institute and Center here in African and African American Studies here at UVA. He's the author of Uplifting the Race, Black Leadership, Politics, and Culture in the 20th Century. And he was awarded the John Hope Franklin Book Prize from the American Studies Association. His book, American Africans in Ghana, Black Expatriates in the Civil Rights Era, was a choice outstanding academic title. And while at the University of Michigan, in the past, he was the past president of the American Studies Association. And while at the University of Michigan, he was the director of the Department of Afro-American and African Studies from 2005 to 2010. And I think for the first time on a Miller Center program, we're delighted to have Carolyn Janney with us, who is the John L. Now Professor in History and a professor in the history of the American Civil War and the director of the John L. Now III Center for Civil War History here at UVA's Department of History. Carrie's specialties include the U.S. Civil War, 19th century American history, women and gender history, and memory. Having also earned her PhD and BA from UVA, Janney is the author of Remembering the Civil War, Reunion and the Limits of Reconciliation. She's also the author of Burying the Dead but Not the Past, Ladies' Memorial Associations and the Lost Cause, and dozens of articles and book chapters. And finally, my co-host is Melody Barnes, who is the co-director for Policy and Public Affairs in the College of Arts and Sciences Democracy Initiative, which is an interdisciplinary teaching, research, and engagement effort led by the college in partnership here with the Miller Center. She's also the Dorothy Danforth Compton Professor of Practice here at the Miller Center and a Distinguished Fellow at UVA's School of Law. During the Barack Obama administration, Melody was assistant to the president and director of the White House Domestic Policy Council in President Obama's first term. She was also executive vice president for policy at the Center for American Progress and chief counsel to the late Senator Ted Kennedy, on the Senate Judiciary Committee. She's the co-editor of Community Wealth Building and the Reconstruction of American Democracy. So Melody, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Bill. It is a pleasure to be here with you and partnering to support the work of the Institute of Democracy, which brings together our fantastic colleagues from across schools and departments across the University of Virginia. Well, it's Thursday afternoon, and it's been a couple of days, and Americans are still waiting. I see Paul nodding. Americans are still waiting to learn the results of our election. And certainly there are those around There are those around the world who are waiting to learn the same. Huh. I'll try that again. Okay. Okay, it looks like we're clear. So, well, the thing we are also clear on is that everybody's waiting to find out the results of our election. We know from history that it is not uncommon to have to wait days or even weeks to find out the results of the election. But what's so significant about election 2020 is that there are significant questions that it has raised for all of us, not only in terms of the outcome, but what will governing look like for the next president of the United States? And what are the implications for the country in terms of policy and even how we come together an American identity? Between today and the day that we have a final decision, I think people want to know just how fraught will the path be? Will there be growing protests? Will there be many recounts? Will there be litigation? Might Congress ultimately have to become involved? We also want to know if the assumptions that have been made about the African American and the Latinx and women communities and women voters, what they mean for us. Why did people make those assumptions and how wrong were they? What are the lessons learned? And also, what are the implications for Democrats and Republicans, not only nationally, but also down ballot? And what are the issues that Americans consider to be most important? And if we can't even agree on those issues, how can we ultimately come together and reach consensus about the solutions? So those are some of the questions that we want to engage our panel on. And we're going to have questions for you, members of the audience as well. So not only do we encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A function and we'll weave them in, but stay tuned because during our conversation, we're going to pose a few questions for you to learn what you're thinking as well. To get started, I want to begin with Paul. And Paul, I'm hoping what you'll do for us is provide some context to set the landscape for us. 2 days later, where are we?
Well, Melody, those are great questions. And you, of course, have articulated a long list of really important, really pressing questions. And, the overarching context is one of uncertainty. There's a lot that we don't know. There's always a great deal of uncertainty heading into any election. And there is often, as you've said, uncertainty coming out of an election. I think Carrie can talk about some of the uncertainties that we've seen in the past, but many of us here on the panel and at this event remember the election of 2000 when it wasn't a day or two or a week that we didn't know the outcome. It was more than a month. And one of the things that I shared with my students, all of whom are too young really to remember that election, is that that wasn't a crisis, right? We waited patiently and there was ultimately a resolution. One important difference between 2020 and 2000 is that it's not one state. It was at the end of the night at ABC News, where I spend my election nights, an unprecedented 9 states in which we had not made a projection as to the outcome. As of 3 o'clock, there are still 6 states whose outcomes have not been officially projected by ABC News and many other media outlets. And those states are Arizona, Nevada, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, and Alaska. Alaska is the least surprising. It takes a very long time every election to finish the process of counting votes. And it will almost surely re-elect vote for President Trump and to re-elect its Republican senator. The other states are more uncertain. Joe Biden is currently, as I suspect most people on this Zoom know, currently ahead in Arizona, slightly more narrowly in Nevada. He is currently behind in the vote count in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. But in a context like this, things can change significantly and they can change quickly. I was afraid you were going to ask me, Melody, what will we know and when will we know it? I don't know the answer to either of those things. Clearly, Joe Biden has some more options, more paths to 270 electoral votes, more viable, realistic paths at this point, but it is not a sure thing. People are reporting and repeating all sorts of information and sometimes rumors as to when a particular state is going to make a final announcement about its vote count. Keep in mind that something that is happening and something that always happens is that it takes a while to count the vote. And in every election, absentee ballots arrive after election day and are counted as they are legally required to be. I think it's clear, it's important for us to be clear about what is normal that we are witnessing now, because even the fact of the vote taking a long time to count, that's not abnormal, that is normal. What's unusual is that this is an election taking place in the context of a global pandemic. And the most fundamental, the most direct and fundamentally important implication of that is that we had over 100 million early and by mail voters. That's by far more than we have ever seen before. And in many states, by election day, turnout in early turnout had exceeded that of all turnout in 2016. That was true in a whole bunch of states, and in another batch of states, it was almost as high. Turnout, and we can talk a little bit about more about this later. This will be the highest turnout that we have seen in this country since the election of 1900. We're looking at early estimates have voter turnout as a proportion of the voting eligible population at something like 66%, north of 66%. We're looking at somewhere around 160 million people voting. That is absolutely incredible. That is astounding.
Yeah, that is good news for democracy. No matter what else happens, that we've got that many people who are voting. Paul, two quick questions for you. You said 100 million early voting. Yeah. What's the norm for early voting?
Oh, I don't know, Melody, but somewhere between half and 2/3 of that. I mean, okay. Maybe even less. It was really unprecedented, and as many of the people here can attest personally, the lines to vote early were, here in Charlottesville, down the mall. In some parts of Northern Virginia and in Georgia, it was a 2 or 3 hour wait to vote early. That's unbelievable. I'm somebody who has voted early in every presidential election since 1996 because I've always been away on election day. And it's always been a pleasant chat between me and the voter registrar because nobody else is voting early, right? So no matter what the outcome of the election is, and we will talk all about the policy and political implications of this. This has been a truly remarkable election to watch, just from the perspective of voter engagement and people who have not given up on the democratic process.
And Paul, last question, I'm going to turn it over to Bill. You do this for ABC News. You're in the room looking at what's happening state by state, making those predictions. With the states that are still outstanding, Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Georgia, without going state by state, but just for the audience, are there general tips about what you're looking for? Or maybe you take a state or two and give us a sense of what you're looking for.
So yes, I'm in the room where it happens. It's the least glamorous job in television news. It is, in a normal year, Melody, a group of academics, political scientists, media people, journalists, who are there looking at data as election day unfolds, various streams of data, and we are using modeling to try to ascertain as quickly as possible what the likely outcome is going to be in a particular state, given what we know about where the vote is coming in. And that's really the key. And it's key outside of the room to be asking not just how many votes are outstanding in Pennsylvania, but what percentage of those votes are outstanding in Philadelphia, in Allegheny County, where from the city of Pittsburgh, from the Philadelphia suburbs, because what we know about those places enables us to predict something about what is likely to happen. Now, one of the most important factors to keep in mind in this election goes back to what people have been talking about, a red mirage, a blue wave. And that is based, given what I was talking about a moment ago, the unprecedented numbers of early and by mail votes. They get processed often, well, it really varies from state to state. But in many states, what is going on right now is the counting of early votes, which we know were overwhelmingly, disproportionately, and overwhelmingly Democratic. And so to the extent that in these places, outstanding vote is more Democratic, that's good for Joe Biden. To the extent that it's coming from more rural parts of the state, more Republican parts of the state, that means that Donald Trump will either narrow the gap or widen his lead. And so the real question is, over the next 12, 24, 36 hours, what is being counted? We will find out. And notwithstanding the rumors, I suspect that the next 2 days will bring some degree of, well, some reduction in uncertainty. How about
that? That was a smart way to say it. Bill, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, yeah, I just want to draw Carrie in here. Carrie, we had mentioned before, including Paul, I never thought about the fact that Paul's first time on the decision desk was 2000. That's a baptism by fire. But we've had other fires around election time in American history, essentially having invented the popular vote in this country and inventing it in a gradual way in the 19th century. So give us some insight into that. Where hasn't it worked well before? How have some of those gotten resolved, particularly where there's some trench digging on both sides?
Well, first off, thank you for having me as part of this panel. I just want to reiterate that I'm going to take us back to the 19th century, but it was not unusual to not only wait weeks, but months in many cases to find out who the winner was. This was certainly the case in 1876, which took 4 months to get to. Part of the problem was that there wasn't a single election day until after 1845. States could vote anytime between April and December. And so this left people, sometimes they'd wait 11 months after they had voted until they found out who the next president was going to be. So I think some perspective on that front, even if it's 200 years ago, might be good for all of us. But in a couple particular instances, it was because of disputes, whether within the Electoral College or the Electoral College votes themselves. In 1800, for example, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied in the Electoral College, so it gets thrown to the House. In 1824, there are 4 candidates, and the top 3 candidates get thrown to the House for the House to decide. So that was an instance in which there wasn't a majority in the Electoral College. But from my perspective, one of the most contentious elections was 1876. People that might remember back to their US history in high school or college might know that that's the election that allegedly ended Reconstruction. And what's going on in 1876 is, for starters, you have former Confederates who can now vote for the first time So you have a lot of interest among white Southerners in voting for the Democratic Party. They're not going to vote for the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, the party that is enfranchising African Americans. And so on election night, November 7th of 1876, the Democratic nominee, Samuel Tilden, who's from New York, goes to bed that night thinking that he's won the election. He's been assured that he's carried the states in the North that he needed, and he will absolutely carry those Southern states now that former Confederates can vote. But in the middle of the night, his opponent, Rutherford B. Hayes, a Union general himself, gets calls from his operatives, and they tell him, you know what? If the states of South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, 3 states in which Republicans still controlled the state governments, if those 3 states will go Republican, then we can win this election with 20 electoral votes. With the 20 electoral votes that they have, we can win this. And so what happens is they send messages out to those 3 states. And very quickly, Republicans in South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana invalidate the returns that come in from counties. And you know, we could talk about the legitimacy or not, but there was absolutely fraud. There was voter intimidation. There were instances in which the Democratic Party would print just a symbol, and they would hand the ballots. Keep in mind that parties printed their ballots at this point, hand them to African Americans, convincing them that they were voting for the Republican Party. So many, many levels of fraud, but the Republicans throw out those votes. They cast their electoral votes for Hayes, and it seems that Hayes has won. But the Democrats also in those states send in their electoral votes. So a very messy, long story short, finally, at the end of January, so we've gone from November to the end of January, Congress creates an Electoral Commission made up of a 15-member board, which includes 5 members of the House, 5 members of the Senate, and 5 members of the Supreme Court. It splits on an 8-7 vote party lines. The Republicans get all 20 of those votes. And so it was who got to choose, who got to make the decision or invalidate electoral college votes. And I'll just end by saying that the most contentious election in I believe in the history of this country was in 1860. And in that particular instance, Abraham Lincoln won, and Southern states, Southern whites refused to accept that he had won the presidency, and that's what leads to secession. So secession is an immediate reaction to Lincoln's election and the simple refusal by a significant portion of the country not to see that vote as legitimate.
One can only imagine the CNN versus Fox telling of those stories, but in a sense that was also happening, right? You had alternative media is playing to very alternative electorates that saw the world in very different ways.
Absolutely. And the newspapers at that time are partisan newspapers. So they are telling their story. In fact, it's a Democratic newspaper editor who wires Hayes and tells him, guess what? You've actually lost this election. So all sorts of involvement by many different players as well.
I think it's a great transition back, Melody, to some of the issues that you and Kevin and perhaps Paul have been following as well on the current electorate.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, talking about the history that Carrie just shared and this perspective of different parts of the country based on geography, based on race. And I think it's particularly important because one of the big stories that's been emerging as we look at exit polls from the 2020 election is the question of who voted for whom and why. And I think also importantly, how does that align with the assumptions that we have about who was going to vote for whom? But before I turn to Kevin and Paul to talk a little bit about that, I think it would be interesting to ask the audience a question, and if we can put it up. We know that President Trump made gains among Black men, among Latinx voters, and white men as well. Was that surprising to you? So we're curious what you think before we go back to Kevin and Paul and talk to our scholars about that question.
Let me say, Mel, I think that tracks with, while we're waiting for some feedback, I do think that tracks with a lot of the commentary that we talked about yesterday, which is how the polling itself worked in the run up to the election. You know, there were some signs of that in the election, but in the pre-election polling. But the exit polling data really does seem to suggest that there were major inroads made in a number of those areas.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And what we're seeing from the audience is the surprise that pundits have been talking about, that it looks like 84% or so members of our audience were surprised by those gains. And I think, Kevin, turning to you and also engaging you, Paul, in this, if you could tell us what we've seen in terms of the demographic breakdown and why, when you think about this historically, you think about the narrative arc of the 2020 campaign, why the votes may have broken down the way that they have. Kevin, do you want to get us started?
Sure. I mean, you know, there was some data from the exit polls that was white voters went for Trump.
Kevin, maybe turn up your volume just a little bit or a little closer.
Okay. White voters went for Trump, 57-42. That's not a surprise, obviously. And just to place the white vote for Biden in context, 42-43% is about par for the course for the white vote. Obama received about 43% of the white vote. Somewhat of a surprise, perhaps, white women went for Trump in a solid majority, 55 to 43%. And you know, on some of the issues, Biden won huge majorities for those for whom racial justice and COVID were the most important issues. Biden also won a solid majority of 63% for those who were concerned about healthcare. Trump voters tended to cite the economy and crime and safety as their top issues by a sizable margin. And so, you know, Trump's campaigning on the issue of law and order apparently bore fruit. Character obviously counts, or perhaps counts less for some voters. People overwhelmingly chose Biden as more likely to unite the country. And that was by over three quarters of those who thought that was an important issue chose Biden. For those who prefer a strong leader, they went for Trump, 71% to 28%. So clearly empathy was not as important to them. You know, Biden was basically reminding us, you know, every other breath that he was the empathetic candidate. And then this question about which candidate cares more about me, that was pretty much an even split, 50-50. But to get to the issue that I think surprised a lot of pundits and observers, why did, for example, 8% of Black women and 18% of Black men vote for Trump? And I think that outreach to African-American voters was pretty pronounced. I mean, there were a lot of people who felt that after Trump's first term, just the catastrophes around COVID, around racial justice issues, and Trump's, you know, sort of inflammatory rhetoric, his polarizing rhetoric on race would clearly set him back among African-American voters. And many people remembered with a sense of bitter irony of Trump's sort of closing argument to Black voters in 2016. What have you got to lose? Well, apparently, the outreach of the Trump campaign to both Black men and Black women worked. You recall earlier in the campaign cycle, the publicity stunt election of Kanye West, the rapper. And Kanye West was sort of known as personally close to Trump. You also have in Trump's camp a very prominent African-American woman surrogate named Candace Owens, and they were sort of making constant outreach. One of the more insightful things that I saw in those who were sort of identifying Black men as a target group of the Trump campaign was that many Black men have issues with the leadership of the Black Lives Matter movement. They're coming from a place perhaps of misogyny or homophobia to the predominantly African-American and queer LGBTQ leadership of the Black Lives Matter movement. So that was one possibility. But I think in general, for Black men, and I'm less confident of this, making this argument in the case of Black women, but for Black men, I think that those who supported Trump really identified with the power and the impunity that Trump represents and manifests on a daily basis. And I think that there is that identification with a certain kind of aggressive masculinity as well that we certainly see in Trump. So, and it wasn't just Kanye West. Trump had made an outreach to other male hip hop artists, which was quite controversial. Some of them had actually renounced, their, apparent support for Trump at the 11th hour after sort of an outcry from within the Black community. I think we also have to remember that before Trump became a very controversial political leader, when he was a celebrity, when he was a real estate tycoon who was always in the news, he was one of the most frequently referenced celebrities among hip hop artists. And so I think that there is this, again, very problematic identification with the form of masculinity that Trump exhibits and represents. I could say more, and I think that there's also the question that we were also asked about the strong Latino vote, Latinx vote for Trump. And that's a very complicated question. The Latinx community is so politically and geographically diverse. Clearly, the Latinx community in Florida is quite diverse, and many of the, I think we have to see the strong support among the Latinx community for Trump in the context of the traditional Republican Party support for the Cuban exile community. I think that's always been a real, the GOP has been able to rely on that in the state of Florida. But maybe I will just pause there and we can come back to this issue. And Paul, I'm sure, has other thoughts to share.
Yeah, Paul, I'm curious what you would have to add to what Kevin was just describing, including the fact that the Latinx community nor the Black community is monolithic. It's not homogeneous. The geography and also the issues. I think a lot of people, many people I know would say, wow, there were children being separated from parents at the border. Isn't that an issue that would galvanize the Latinx community or other communities? But when it comes to issues that were most important or the perspectives across a diverse community, that may not have been at the top of the list.
So, Kevin, you're right. I do have some things to say about this, but let me try to keep it short. First, Kevin, I think you're absolutely right to call our attention to diversity within heterogeneity within groups, and I think in particular among Black voters, looking at change between men and women is really important and fits into exactly what you're describing. In the aggregate, I want to make sure that we don't overstate the change. African Americans voted for Donald Trump. I think we said 87%. It was It was 89% voting Democratic in 2016. Neither is a surprise. Black voters are the most consistently Democratic voters, and so I want to be careful that we don't overstate the change, and that we're clear about what's consistent while we're looking at what has changed. Now, in terms of what has changed, when it comes to issues, it's really important to keep in mind that the exit poll is a closed-ended survey, right? They're not saying, hey, please write an essay about the top issues that influenced your vote today. They're not even asking what were the top issues. They're saying of the following issues, and there are usually 3, 4, or 5 of them, which was most important. So we are at the mercy of the decisions that have been made by the exit poll question writers. It's almost poignant to look back 5 years and 4 years ago and look at the questions, the issues that they included on the exit poll. Here they were: foreign policy, remember that? Immigration, the economy, and terrorism. Of those, the economy in 2016 was the most cited, most important issue. 52%, more than half of Americans cited the economy as the most important issue, American voters facing their, influencing their vote. This year, the questions were racial inequality, coronavirus, the economy, crime and safety, and healthcare policy. So a different set of issues reflecting the best judgment of the people making these questions. And as Kevin notes, the economy was #1. It was cited by 35% of Americans, 35%, down from 52%. #2 was racial inequality. Racial inequality. It's we can think about what it means to phrase the issue using those words. 20% cited racial inequality, 17% coronavirus, 11% health and safety, 11% healthcare policy. That's not to say that people who cited the economy weren't also concerned with the coronavirus at all. But it just is to say that when forced to choose, they chose the economy. And Kevin made the really important point that of those 35% choosing the economy, 82% voted for Donald Trump. Of those who selected racial inequality, 91% voted for Biden. And so what we are seeing is absolutely this partisan grouping around these issues.
And Paul, you just went through the list of questions in that exit poll. We want to ask our audience the same question. So we're going to toss that question to the audience for their answer. And as you all are providing an answer for us on this one, I'm also curious, and this is a question that also comes from the audience, what role do you think that Kamala Harris's vice presidential candidacy played when we're talking about these issues in terms of both race, gender, but also subject matter issues? Her role as a federal prosecutor, a former prosecutor, how might that have had a role to play in some of the shifting and some of the surprises that we saw with regard to demography?
Well, I think that Kamala Harris' presence on the ticket, historic presence on the ticket, certainly drove the enthusiasm of African-American women voters. But there I would qualify that by saying that African-American women voters who had been supporting the party for many years, who perhaps have a sense of history associated with their support for the Democratic Party, would certainly be inspired by Kamala Harris. I think younger African-American voters and even younger African-American women voters might have had a little ambivalence about Kamala Harris. I think that she seemed to be doing quite well in the primary until on Twitter, this discussion really sort of trended about her past as a prosecutor and her record as a prosecutor and her perceived role in punishing Black youth. And I think that there's still a lot of ambivalence about Harris from younger African Americans about that. I personally think that she stands to be our first Black president. I think that Joe Biden has made it known that it's not a foregone conclusion that he will run for re-election and serve 2 terms as is usually expected. So I think that that will be an ongoing discussion about her past. And I think obviously she brings very formidable political skills as someone who I think really attracted notice through her interrogations as a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee of Jeff Sessions and Bill Barr, and also the nominee Brett Kavanaugh. So I think she is someone who will be a powerful and hopefully not too polarizing presence on the national scene.
Well, Bill, I'm going to turn this back to you, but just for the audience, it looks as though you all are saying COVID-19 is the issue that mattered to you most when voting, and that's ahead by about 8% of social justice issues, followed by healthcare. So interesting to think about how all this is lining up with what our fellow citizens are thinking nationally. Bill?
Well, we got about 20 minutes left, so I'm going to do a quick lightning round with our panelists and then turn it back to the audience. And I'm really interested to bring Carrie back into this again. We've discussed the narrow issues of polling numbers. We've discussed some broad demographic issues and the changing American electorate, and then the changing features of our democracy. Do you have a key single takeaway about the state of our democracy based on this election? And I'm willing to even share mine, but I want to hear yours first.
Well, I find it, maybe 2. Can I have 2 brief ones?
Yeah, sure.
I find it at the same time promising that we've seen the turnout and the enthusiasm that we've seen. On the other hand, the flip side of that is that, at least in the period that I spend most of my time in, the 2 elections that saw the highest turnout were 2 periods of intense sectional discord and intense division within the country. And so I do have this feeling, this sobering feeling that even though we have so many people involved, that we have a more divisive country than I think than I wanted to believe until I really started seeing those poll numbers.
Thanks. Kevin?
I agree with Carrie. I mean, I think that the democracy in this country has basically become partisan. Voting rights has become partisan. And, you know, it's encouraging to see the high level of participation in this election. And it's encouraging to see the determination of all of those who are going to vote despite the pandemic, despite efforts of voter suppression. But I really do think that the incessant attack on democratic norms and on the principle of one person, one vote from the Oval Office has turned voting, which used to be a bipartisan issue, into this partisan issue. And I have deep concerns going forward for the implications of that.
Paul? And then Melody, I'm coming to you too.
Well, I don't think we needed this election to inform us that that all is not well with respect to adherence to democratic norms. They are under fire and under threat, and I think we're in a precarious time. Arguably, this very moment that we are in is exactly when these norms and institutions are most fragile. And I think we need to be vigilant. I think we need to be extraordinarily attentive to what goes on in the next 12 hours and in the coming days and weeks. They were boarding up shops in Washington, D.C. ahead of Tuesday's election. We made it this far, right? Things are still intact, but it's going to, I think, take a great deal of attention and care and, as I say, vigilance to ensure that these democratic norms and processes are respected and that we treat them with great care as we watch what unfolds over the next few days.
I agree with my colleagues. As Bill, I know you've heard me often say, I think politics is a lagging indicator, and that what we get from politics is a snapshot of what actually sits deep in American culture. And so the friction, the strife, the deep concerns that we are seeing reflected in this election are reflecting something that's been sitting in culture for a very, very, very long time. And for a host of reasons, it's starting to surface itself in more plain ways. In business, they often say that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think that culture sets the table for democracy in terms of norms, in terms of institutions, and how all of that interacts with one another. I have been deeply concerned for some time, which is why I feel fortunate to do the work that I'm doing at the University of Virginia, but concerned about American democracy and, in fact, democracy worldwide.
Well, I'm going to give a slightly different answer than all of you, which is not to say that I disagree, because I find all of that super interesting, including, as Carrie knows, that I've been racking my brain from 1850 to 1876 this summer. But the thing that I find most fascinating, and maybe a positive story in this, is in the middle of a pandemic, the likes of which the country hasn't seen in 100 years, we completely overhauled our election system. And it was an uncontrolled experiment. In a controlled experiment, you change one feature and you see how it responds. But every state did it slightly differently. Some had early in-person voting, some had absentee, automatic ballots, automatic registration. I mean, it was bizarre, different, not always perfect. We're still living with that. But it was an extraordinary statement about American innovation in the face of a crisis. And one of the dimensions of that is so apparent goes to the culture, which is we're seeing the electoral map changing. The Biden coalition is unlike any other coalition I've ever seen. The Bill Clinton coalition was, let's see if we can get working class whites that live in states that border the Mississippi or Ohio River. And if we can win those states, we can win back the map, which they hadn't won in 3 cycles. The Obama coalition was totally different from that. It was North Carolina and Virginia with emerging yuppies and others, and then taking back some of the industrial Midwest. But the idea that the Biden coalition might include all of the songs, all of the states in Steve Miller's Keep Rockin' Me Baby, from Phoenix, Arizona, all the way to Tacoma, Washington, Philadelphia, Atlanta, and LA. That is a crazy coalition. And I think that's a really interesting statement about where our country's going.
Yeah.
Going to some audience questions. We have one from, I'm going to ask 2, one from Elspeth Payne. Do you anticipate reform to the US electoral system in the aftermath of this election? And then a question about whether your opinion is on voter fraud accusations from the Trump campaign. Is there a legitimacy to these claims? They go to the legitimacy of the current system, and I'm curious to get people's take on that.
Well, I'll let Paul or Kevin answer more about the present, but this is we've seen 5 times already when the popular vote has outpaced the Electoral College. Many of us remember 2000 and 2016, but it also happened 3 times in the 19th century. And I believe, again, I'm a 19th century historian, but 1969 was the last time that Congress even debated direct election. The House voted yes, the Senate killed it. But I can't help but wondering if those conversations won't bubble up again if we see this pattern once more.
I'll just speak to the question of voter fraud. I think that has been the GOP line for justifying voter suppression measures and state laws that have proliferated since the 2010s and were given even more momentum by the Supreme Court's gutting of the Voting Rights Act in Shelby v. Holder in 2013. So I don't think all of these legal challenges to the counting of votes in several swing states has any merit. I don't think the charge of voter fraud has any merit. It's just a lot of throwing spaghetti and seeing what sticks.
Bill,
I'm
sorry, Paul. No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add, with respect to the structure and the mechanisms of voting, this goes, Melody, I think to your comment about culture eating strategy for breakfast. I think I think that vote by mail and voting early in person and voting in all sorts of other ways will be here to stay, even if we do eventually get this pandemic behind us. I also suspect that events like this will continue to be held in a variety of formats. I think we're going to see a lot of both and across the board, and I think that's going to be true with voting as well.
I was just going to say, Bill, maybe we should ask the audience a question as well. I don't know if that's what you were thinking, but just getting a sense about the degree to which the audience will trust the outcome of this election, since we were just having a bit of a conversation about election reform and potential fraud.
So the question is, what is transpiring with the slow vote count in some states? Will you trust the outcome of the election? Let me go to one more question from the audience. There were a number of questions about polling, so let's come back to those. How accurate is polling when increasingly Americans do not answer calls either on landlines or cell phones, and or the number is not known and recognized by the call recipient? There was a question about the shy Trump or shy Biden voter. My question to Paul is there any way of knowing whether the poll was off because polls were off because polls couldn't test turnout in a pandemic year? They can say, how likely is it are you to vote? Are the polls turnout dependent? So those are three polling questions, maybe directed to Paul, but I'm just as curious to hear Kevin and Carrie's responses. So
let me just say very quickly, and I want to thank the audience member for this excellent question. Let me say, yes, Bill, pre-election polls are always dependent upon the ability to estimate voter turnout, to create a model of the likelihood that somebody is going to vote. That's always going to be a challenge, and I think that in many ways it was more challenging this year. I also want to suggest that we don't know the way in which or the extent to which the polls blew it this year. I think we ought to go slow. A lot of people thought, well, in 2016, the polls got it so wrong. In fact, the polls got most of 2016 more or less right. The polls went awry in particular states. They just happened to be the consequential states for 2016. I think it's too early to really do an analysis, a post-mortem on the polling industry, because I'm not really sure that the polling industry is dead yet. I will believe it when in 2018, no Republican or Democratic candidate for office hires a pollster.
And all of Washington just shook at the very thought of that.
Kevin and Carrie, have you been watching the polls? You have reactions to how the turnout, and not just the turnout of people who voted, but the actual numbers of votes track with the polls, what the polls got right and wrong?
I think we should just defer our judgment about the polls until all the votes are counted, and then we can sort of map the performance of the electorate and their choices to the actual polls. I think that everyone was saying that the polls were wrong last time in 2016, but they actually were a fairly accurate measure of the national vote.
Yeah, I concur that we really have to wait until everything is in before we can make these types of interpretations.
Just to echo on that, one thing to keep in mind is the final national popular vote, because often the national polls are tracked with the whole population as a whole. And California, for instance, has only reported about 75% of its vote. There are a number of states that are still having numbers come in. As those numbers come in right now, Vice President Biden is at 50.5%. And typically he was polling at 51 to 52%. And by the time California and other states' numbers roll in, he might roll to that. And so one interpretation may be that a number of undecided voters or people that weren't willing, they might have said they were undecided. Their shyness might not have been to say, I'm voting for Biden. It might, if they were Trump voters, they might not have wanted to own up to being Biden voters, Trump voters, and simply said that they were undecided about who they were going to vote for. And if you look at a lot of the Midwestern states that Trump is winning, like Wisconsin and Michigan, he is at about 50 to 51%, sometimes high 49 in Wisconsin, and in Minnesota, he's at 52%. That was about the number he was hitting in a lot of the pre-election polls. And there was still a gap of undecided with Trump at about 44, 45. And so it may simply be that a lot of undecideds, they didn't lie, they just wouldn't say Trump's name. Anyhow, Melody, I saw you raising.
Well, I was just going to underscore your point. Looking at the exit polling data, while about 72% of the electorate decided before September who they were going to vote for, 5% decided in the last week. And if you cover the month of October, 13% of the electorate decided who they were going to vote for. And I think when you mix that with, and Paul is far more of an expert than I, but whenever I was looking at those polls, it just over time, but certainly even in the last couple of weeks, they were tightening, but often they were within the margin of error. And I think sometimes people look and say, oh, Biden was up by, 4 points, or 47 to 43 or 41, but that was within the margin of error. So when we add that all together, the polls may not have been that far off.
So we've got about 3 minutes left. I wanted, since Melody, you put the question back out to the audience, I'm struck by how many people have asked a similar question, which is why in the first or in the second poll that we posted, what was in the other category, or why wasn't Trump's personality a referendum on the president? One of the questions asked. Norman asks how many people voted because of Trump's rhetoric and lying, or maybe because of Trump's rhetoric and bluntness. So I guess in the last minute, going around for everybody to give a minute of closing thoughts, but including, was this after all a referendum on President Trump? And again, we still have votes to count, but do you see the election as a referendum on Trump or not?
Yes.
Very much so.
I see it as a referendum on our larger society and culture that includes Trump as the representative of a significant portion.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree. I think that it is, it's going to create a really interesting research problem for people to understand how after so many failures in his first term, that people were willing, so many people were willing to vote for him again.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Let me just add, elections are always referenda on an incumbent president or the party of an incumbent president. That's just fundamental to the nature of elections and vote choice. And so in that sense, this election was no different. We had a conversation earlier today in which we were looking at differential enthusiasm among Democrats and Republicans. And interestingly, although people are very quick to talk about the enthusiasm of Trump supporters, Democratic voters in late October were about 9 points more enthusiastic about voting this year than Republicans. The difference was they weren't so much enthusiastic about voting for Joe Biden. They were very enthusiastic about voting against Donald Trump.
Mel, any closing thoughts to bring us home?
Well, mainly, I want to thank our audience and to thank this panel for another real interesting and substantive conversation. I think we are all taking this in day by day, and some of us minute by minute, and trying to digest and understand not only what the outcome will be and who will sit at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, which is obviously a significant question, and in both houses of Congress, but to understand what this means for our country and for our culture. And I think the ability to do that together in a moment where things aren't always clear and things aren't certain yet is certainly quite gratifying. So I want to thank the panelists and thank the audience for participating with us as well. Bill?
Well, my thanks to everyone, including to Melody and to our whole communications team for having worked so hard to pull this series together, not just series of events, but go to our website, please. At millercenter.org, you can also find links to the Aftermath, Election 2020 Aftermath webpage, which is something that Melody and our communications team pulled together, and that all of the scholars that you saw today, yesterday, and in the future have been writing and blogging on. They've been writing 200 to 400 word essays that are really rich and interesting takes on the election. And we're really grateful for them for joining, and for you, the audience, joining. And then finally, our supporters, again, thanks to the Marcuses for the Democracy Praxis Fund, and everybody who supports the Miller Center. You allow us to do this great work, which is a real privilege for us. So thank you all, and we'll see you tomorrow, same bat time, same bat channel.
Thank you.